Welcome to this summer meeting here at the Chamber of Labour on the topic of European workers and employees under pressure. Today it's not as pressing hot as outside, but I believe that Europe in general and the European labour market is under massive pressure. We know that in the Eurozone almost 20 million people are unemployed. In the entire European Union it's 27 million, and in the majority of the EU member countries unemployment rates are constantly increasing. So the end of the crisis, although some always want to tell us that it is there, it is out of sight. Something we would also like to focus on is what do these developments in the labor market mean for the future of Europe, for the social systems in Europe, and for us at large. Well, by way of introduction, I would like to welcome our host, the President of the Vienna Chamber of Labour, Rudi Kaske. A warm welcome to you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I wish you a wonderful afternoon, well-tempered today. Although today we are discussing a hot topic. And on behalf of the Vienna Chamber of Labour, together with the Rennerinstitut, I would like to welcome you because we jointly organized this event. And we would like to focus on the important topic of European workers and employers under pressure. Well, I have the pleasure of welcoming high-level international guests at this event. The Director General of the International Labour Organization, Ryder, has come. A warm welcome to you. And the Director of the Research Department at the European Trade Union Institute, Maria Jepsen, is also in our midst. Hello. And on a national level, we also have the top representative, our Federal Minister for Labour, Social Affairs and Consumer Protection, Rudolf Hundstorfer. A warm welcome, dear Rudi. And on behalf of all experts, I may welcome in our midst the head of the Austrian Institute for Economic Research, Karl Aiginger. And you, ladies and gentlemen, because you make this event exciting and interesting, and we look forward to your contributions. Well, the title of today's event, well, puts it very clear. European workers are under massive pressure. And what is very important to me, and I would like to stress that right at the beginning, our solidarity is with those employed in Europe on the one hand, and on the other hand, we shall have a solidarity with the millions of unemployed people in Europe or people who look for jobs all across Europe. From my point of view, the European Union is in a crisis that undermines its existence. Austria has managed its crisis better than, for instance, the southern European EU member states. But we must not be indifferent to the future in these countries and to the future of the workers in Europe at large, because the alarmingly increasing unemployment rates, not only among young people, social and especially regional cohesion are, from my point of view, at risk, because existing potentials and talents remain untapped. And especially in the south of Europe, there seems to be a generation emerging that has no hope at all. It is very clear that the European and still mainly economically based vision of integration in existing form must be questioned substantially, because in the meantime all those responsible should be aware of the fact that the unilateral austerity policy has failed. As mentioned at the beginning, for the last 5 years, recession, record unemployment rates, and worsening of the realities of life are constantly in the headlines. And I ask myself, when does the European Commission assume its social responsibility? Because Europe, dear colleagues, most urgently needs a change of course. In part, this insight is already there with high-level EU representatives, and most prominently the EU President of the Commission, José Manuel Barroso, expressed that, because in the meantime, probably it was just a one-day event, but I don't know. But he came to a remarkable conclusion, because he said it is precisely those European countries with the most effective social protection systems and with the most developed social partnerships that are among the most successful and competitive economies in the world. Well, this more or less sounds like a description of the so-called Austrian approach, the Austrian path. And key reason why Austria has better managed the economic crisis so far is, alongside a well-developed social state, also the model of social partnership we have. Social partnership and the social state, from my point of view, need to play a more prominent role in Europe, not only in order to manage the current crisis, but in general, from my point of view, it is about progress, and especially social progress in Europe, that is at stake. And the inconsistencies and also the controversies in these connections are reflected by the imbalances. And in the morning, I was at an event in which also our Minister of Finance participated, and there is this imbalance between austerity targets and the social targets, because our social minister also participated in this event. Well, let me give you an example. On the 20th of February of this year, László Andor, EU Commissioner for Employment, Social and Inclusion, presented the so-called social investment package. And the central message was that if Europe takes the necessary investment in the social area right now, so from the development of social infrastructure to a proactive labor market policy, then the European Union will emerge stronger, more cohesive and more competitive from the current crisis. At the same time, ladies and gentlemen, the EU Ministers of Finance and the EU Commission, with tightened fiscal policy rules and with threatening competitive packages, restrict the room for maneuver of the member states. What an inconsistency. Well, ladies and gentlemen, for me it is very clear that Europe has the chance to, well, grow out, if I may put it like that, grow out of this crisis if it focuses clearly on an active employment and growth policy, because I firmly believe that we can achieve a more social Europe if more people are able to do gainful employment and if the prosperity people worked for is equitably distributed. So what does it need? This requires a credible change of paradigms of the central players towards an investive and preventive strategy in central policy actions and areas of action. We require macro policy activity that promotes employment, and we need to reduce unemployment rates. We require high quality further education and training systems. We require a better life-work balance. We need to improve healthcare protection as a prerequisite for being able to work longer and more healthily. And Social Minister Hundstorfer mentioned that in the morning we require the development of adequate workplaces for senior citizens, and we need to change precarious and informal work types into regular types of employment, and we require an equitable distribution of gainful employment and a fair distribution of the prosperity we have worked for. Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, well, also at the company level, we require changes. And, well, what do I mean by that? We need more appreciation for workers and employees. Respect is the key word in this connection. And we also need a working climate in which workers feel good. And we need to design work and labor. And since I'm a trade union representative, I may say that this is also reflected in a fair and sound remuneration. And we require further education, training, and further activities in the company. These investments are a key factor and are pivotal to Europe's ability to succeed in the international competition. Ladies and gentlemen, from my point of view, Europe is at a crossroads. The issue of distribution, active economic policy for work and prosperity, more commitment for young people, these are key elements for this change of course. But whether there will be such a change of course is open. So it is all the more important that we become active, that we pursue an active line of policy, that we are proactively committed to a social Europe, and that we also learn from the best, and that we join forces undeterred for this change of course in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish today's event, and we have some outstanding speakers and panelists today. So I hope that we will be able to look over the rim of our national teacup. I ask you to contribute proactively to today's discussion, further discussions. Wish you an interesting and successful meeting. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, well, my role is a quite easy one because Rudi Kaske has almost said everything that was there to say. I do not have to repeat what he said. Well, I believe that the most essential reasons for jointly organizing this event have already been mentioned by Rudi. And, well, let me put it from a party politic perspective and not so much from a social partner point of view. I believe that the Social Democrats would do very wisely if they refocused on the roots and on the fundamental directions, and to remind their basis and the reasons for being, and this is representing the interests of workers, and especially both at the national and the European level. And I believe that this is a prerequisite for our activity and all our work. and we should, well, assume a more consistent approach than probably, well, we have been. Well, okay, so much about that. And in this spirit, I would like to thank you very much for participating in today's event. I believe that we are on the right path. We have high-level guests and panelists here in our midst. And, well, I wish you a highly interesting afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Karl A.Duffek. Well, I think that Karl A.Duffek and Rudi Kaske have given us the key words for today's afternoon. Social partnership, social democracy, growth, prosperity, distribution, representing interests of workers, Europe, and then the issue, no value added without appreciation. And this is also very important. And this brings me to our keynote speakers of today. Well, and when I had a look at the curriculum vitae of our keynote speaker today, Guy Ryder, I noticed that Guy Ryder was born in Liverpool when young John Lennon founded his band Quarrymen. So it doesn't come as a surprise that Guy Ryder has embarked on an international career. So today, Guy Ryder is the Director General of ILO, and I bid him a very warm welcome and ask for his contribution.
Friends, what a pleasure it is to be back in Austria, back in Vienna, which is a city with a certain importance for me. And I want to say that when I was elected as Director General of the ILO last October, one of the first messages I got was from Minister Hundstorfer asking me to come to Austria, to Vienna, and I didn't know if it was an invitation or an order or an instruction. And I still don't know which it was, but in any case, I want to thank the Rennerinstitut for giving me the chance to accept the invitation or obey the order and to be with you today. You know, there is something of a paradox about being asked to come to Austria to discuss the crisis in Europe and its effects on working people, because all of the figures, all of the evidence shows that you are doing very well in Austria in navigating this crisis without the extraordinarily negative social impact that working people are feeling in many other countries. So it doesn't in some ways feel like the right place to come to talk about the crisis. And yet I think that Mr. Kaske has given us the answer to that paradox, the key to unlocking that paradox. You said, Rudi, that nobody certainly in this room, but nobody in general, should be indifferent to what is happening in Europe today and the effects of this crisis. I was struck by the words of the Pope, of all people, when he visited Lampedusa, the island in the Mediterranean, where migrants wash up on the journey from Africa to Europe, coming to Europe to escape crisis. He spoke then of the globalization of indifference. And I think one thing we have to give as a signal is a rejection of indifference to the crisis. And we need to be active in our response. So it is a real pleasure to be here. Now, colleagues, Europe has traditionally been, for the ILO, a reference point. It's been the European social model which historically has been seen as the practical translation of the values, objectives, and methods of the ILO to the task of promoting social justice and at the same time promoting successful economies. So for us, the ILO, Europe is a symbol and an example. And yet, we know that in significant parts of Europe, the reality is a reality of high unemployment, especially for youth, deteriorating social protection, reduced investment, reduced credit flows to enterprises, lower job security, and of course, lower wages. And I've made it a point since I took up my job to find a way for the ILO to play a role in Europe. One of the strange things about the ILO in Europe is that historically it's never really been felt that the ILO had much of a role to play in Europe. Europe was the example, Europe was the locomotive, but a role for the ILO in the countries of Western Europe somehow seemed unnecessary or inappropriate. Our current circumstances mean that that mistaken impression now has to be rethought. And so the commitment of the ILO to a strong work programme in Europe has been a goal, and it was confirmed by the ILO's European Regional Meeting, which took place in Oslo in April of this year, and Minister Hundstorfer was a participant there. And I am quite clear that the ILO's role and assistance is more than ever needed in circumstances in which unemployment has just touched a record 12.1% in the Eurozone countries. That means 19 million plus people without work. Now let's take a look at what is behind those extraordinary figures, over 19 million. Well, they comprise both those people who have lost their jobs, but also those who have never been able to find a job in the first place. The young men and women under the age of 25, whose unemployment rate is nearly 1 in 4 people. And of course, that is a multi-country average, because if we look at Southern Europe, and I know that you know this, Greece is now topping the league table with, can you believe it, 64% youth unemployment. Scarier still, 7.5 million young Europeans are not merely out of work, they are neither in education or training either, the so-called NEETs, to use the English acronym. If we talk about a lost generation, here it is. Not a cliche, not a danger, today's reality. Of course, I know that Austria is doing very much better than this. You have one of the lowest unemployment rates around Europe, both for older workers and for young people. But for the reasons that have already been outlined for us, it's clear that no country can or should be immune from the tensions and the pressures that this situation brings about. And let's just pause for a second to consider that with the addition of the 28th member state of the European Union, Croatia, things are not going to improve. Overall unemployment there is 16.5%. Youth unemployment last year was 43%. Now, what I want to try to do in outlining these unemployment challenges is to set the scene for the realities of the pressures faced by working people. And we know that in certain circumstances, the pressures which are being faced run the risk of spilling over into social instability and unrest. I am frequently asked, it's probably the most frequently asked question that I get, at what level of unemployment do you expect the result to be social instability? And I can't answer that question. If somebody asked me that question in 2007 and I'd attempted to give a number, I would have looked very stupid, because I could never imagine that youth unemployment could have reached more than 50% in Spain, more than 60% in Greece, without instability ensuing? My view is it's the wrong question to ask, and if you get asked it, don't answer it. The real question is that we should be acting on mass unemployment, not because of the danger of instability, real as it is, but because of the millions of lives which are being ruined, because of the massive misery which it is engendering. And here is a fact which I ask you to keep in mind, not very well known. All of the empirical evidence shows that even if you have a job, even if you are employed, you have a lower life satisfaction if you are living in a society where many other people are unemployed. This is a reality, and I think it speaks positively of the human instinct for solidarity. We do care about what happens to our neighbours, to our friends, and to our colleagues, and I think it's a thought that we need to take forward as we address the policy agenda. Now, it seems to me that the agenda that you've set for this afternoon's meeting is extremely broad, and it needs to be broad, because the pressures experienced by working women and working men in Europe today are many. It isn't what's happening just to wages. It's not just about working conditions. It's not just about contractual relations at work. It's not just about collective bargaining. It's not just about social protection and pensions. It's about all of those things put together. That's the reality of the force field of pressures in Europe today. But let me start at the most logical place, which is wages. And here I think there are a number of issues that need to be discussed. The level of wages, the rate of increase or decline in wages, the wages differential between women and men, and also the repartition, the share of income between labour and capital. Now, the ILO's done quite a lot of work on wages through our own databases. That work shows that before the crisis years, in a number of countries, Albania, the Baltic states, Romania, Serbia, wages were growing very strongly before the crisis. But for these countries, the crisis turned strong wage growth into negative growth. Looking at the EU 15 countries, policies of wage moderation have prevailed for most of them. And both inside the EU 15 and outside, for example in Norway, in Poland, in Slovenia and Sweden, they were able to have positive real wage growth both before and during the crisis. But these countries are a minority. In the critically affected countries, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Portugal and Spain, the rate of increase in unemployment, of course, has been highest there, but real wages have declined as well. They have also declined in the United Kingdom, in the Czech Republic and Hungary. And this declining income for labour is surely a major source of pressure on the European worker. The ILO, at its European regional meeting in Oslo, presented some of these issues. And one interesting theme that came out of our discussion in our Oslo conference was the question of the use of minimum wages as a policy tool. Now, I know in Austria you're not big on minimum wages. You have very good collective bargaining arrangements. But in countries such as Belgium and Poland and Portugal, the minimum wage has been used as a tool of social protection for vulnerable workers. But elsewhere, minimum wages have been frozen and reduced. In Greece, reduced by nothing less than 22%. And if you take the longer perspective, we will see that since the 1980s, most countries in the industrialized world have seen a downward trend in the labour income share. That is to say, the percentage of national income going to wages has been in the process of long-term decline. And here, to my surprise, I find that Austria is not an exception. The decline in the labour share of national income in your country was down from 69% in 1978 to 57% in 2012. And what we're seeing around the industrial world is a breaking of the link between productivity growth and wage growth. And it strikes me that one of the challenges ahead of us is the restoration of that all-important linkage. Can I say that on top of all of this, and according to their own national poverty lines, more than 18 million working people, people in work, were also in poverty in the European Union in 2011. Women's wages, taken hourly, on average, were 17% lower than men's. I think these are also issues which should not be forgotten or lost in the effects of the crisis. They were there before, they're still with us. That's wages. Let me say something about working conditions. If you look at those paid at a level just above the poverty level, to the level of those who are merely relatively low paid, they can make ends meet. An interesting finding is that the low-paid worker will often rate his life satisfaction or her life satisfaction higher than the worker who has an unpredictable level of security at work or on fixed-term contracts. The point here is money matters, but apparently security and predictability in working life tends to matter more. It's an interesting finding. Now, the work done by our colleagues in Europe in the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions shows an emerging pattern. And it is that those countries with a high share of temporary work before the crisis have reduced that share. That's actually not so surprising, because it's the precarious jobs that tend to disappear first in the crisis. What is more interesting is that those countries which initially had a low share of temporary employment actually increased that share during the crisis. And we can work out why that is the case. Because in a labour market no longer able to provide stable and secure full-time jobs, or don't have the confidence to do so, well, a temporary job is often seen as better than nothing. So to put it another way, job insecurity has increased in much of Europe as a consequence of the crisis, and this is imposing further pressure on workers. And it is often the case in recessions, particularly one of the magnitude of our current recession, the share of involuntary temporary or part-time work has also increased markedly. Colleagues, perhaps more measurable than some of these are the shifting contours of industrial relations in Europe. And we can look at these very clearly in quantifiable terms. We are seeing declining trade union membership in a number of countries around Europe. And while a decline in union membership is not the only challenge facing Europe's trade unions, it seems to be a pretty dominant one. Merely counting the numbers of trade unionists, of course, does not tell us the whole story. There are countries with low formal trade union membership, but very high trade union influence. France is the obvious example of that. But putting membership levels to one side, I think we need to look more carefully at what is happening to collective bargaining. There has been a significant effort to reform collective bargaining process in many countries. Some movement away from centralized bargaining to decentralized bargaining, the possibility to opt out of collective bargaining arrangements in the name of increased competitiveness. And in countries such as Greece, where the Troika has had an influence on the situation, I think we have seen the destruction of collective bargaining processes in a way which is damaging. I can find only one European country where the decentralization trend has been reversed into a re-centralized trend, and that was Finland. Now, my job at the ILO, our job, is to defend fundamental rights at work. It's not to say how those rights should be implemented, but they do need to be implemented and respected. Now, if, I say if, we could find evidence which suggested that decentralization of collective bargaining, flexibilization of collective bargaining arrangements produced improved economic performance, then you could make the argument that there is justification for it. What I have to say is I cannot find any evidence to support that proposition. What can be proven, and this is based on evidence, is that collective bargaining systems that got through the crisis best were those with least structural change, and those with strongest collective bargaining systems, wages suffered least. And given that it is consumption that governments and companies count upon to get us out of the crisis, and that it is wages from employment upon which consumption relies, an argument can be made that institutional reforms of collective bargaining have gone too far. Colleagues, pressure on employed workers in Europe has also got a lot to do with what an employee can look forward to upon retirement. We all know that there are demographic trends, aging populations and others which underlie these concerns. But there are also macroeconomic realities, serious ones, on which the individual employee may have no consciousness or influence. And here we do see the effect of the withdrawal of fiscal stimulus during the crisis and the current trend towards fiscal consolidation. Frankly, the message here is a bleak one. It can be put this way, that the economic cost of unemployment today is higher than it was in the recession years of stimulus because there are fewer benefits. They are of shorter duration. Many might have to look forward to less money when they retire. And it is difficult to believe that these are not sources of worry and pressure on those at work in Europe today. So I think that we do need to think very carefully about the role of social protection as we move forward. Colleagues, it's easy to present the evidence and to be rather pessimistic about the realities of pressure on working people in Europe. The question is, what can we do about all of this? Well, first of all, I think that we can all acknowledge that there is an elephant in the living room, as we say in English, and it is that macroeconomic austerity has overshot its intended goals and is now counterproductive. Even the International Monetary Fund acknowledges that too much, too soon, in fiscal consolidation can, and in certain instances has, choked off the recovery. We have heard the IMF say that the multipliers connecting austerity to jobs and growth have been more potent than they originally thought. And as a non-economist, my reaction is to say, well, if the medicine is stronger than we originally thought, then surely we should be reducing the dose, easing up on the austerity agenda. And I think that is the rethink that needs to be made right now. The ILO also needs to be of assistance to its constituents in every way that we can. We're seeking to do that in different ways. We are seeking to build a stronger basis of evidence-based quality research and analysis upon which to base alternative approaches to exit from the crisis, so that we can give advice on promoting employment-friendly macroeconomic policies for investment in the real economies to produce decent work. And we can give advice with a view to promoting effective and active labour market policies with that strong emphasis on youth unemployment. And we're working together with the European Commission in areas such as the Youth Guarantee Programme. And we can promote effective and sustainable social protection systems. Investment in social protection should properly be seen as an investment, not just a cost. More specifically, the ILO has and will continue to focus its attention and our resources on those countries in Europe which are at the sharpest edge of the crisis. In Greece, from which I've recently come, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland, and now Cyprus as well. We are trying to work with governments and the social partners to try to find agreed ways forward from the crisis. And I'll say something about that in a moment. Our mandate from our European Regional Conference is to assist constituents to address social and economic crisis and to help design sound and equitable reform policies. And of course, we do not ignore that glaring reality of austerity. And we said in Oslo, and it's a key message, that it is possible, it has to be possible, to combine the pursuit of sound macroeconomic goals and fiscal consolidation, where necessary, with the creation and protection of decent jobs and the needs of the most vulnerable. That is the necessary, that is the practical way to tackle the crisis. It's also a message that I'll be able to take next week to Moscow, to the G20 meetings. We have an interesting situation in Moscow next week. We have a meeting of the labour ministers of the G20 countries, and we also have a meeting of the finance ministers of the G20 countries. And this sometimes looks like two separate worlds, the world of labour, the world of finance. So we've done something very clever. We've decided to put them all in the same room for half a day. We will have a joint meeting of ministers of labour and ministers of finance. And I hope in that way we will be able to produce a more coherent, a more cohesive approach to the crisis management, which does combine financial necessities, which we should not ignore, but with the social imperatives of getting people back to work. Colleagues, I want to end what I have to say to you with just two or three thoughts which strike me, having listened to friends in Austria today and having listened to the introductions to this discussion. They strike me as being important. The first thing is that we are here in the heart of Europe talking about the crisis in Europe and the effects on European workers. I ask you to step back a bit from the European realities and look at the global realities. The ILO has 185 member countries, so we're forced to take that global look. You know, much of the world is not living our current circumstances as a crisis. They believe this is a European crisis. They also believe it's an industrialized, a mature, industrialized world crisis. But Latin America is doing very well. Asia is booming. Africa is experiencing its highest levels of sustained growth in independent African history. We can either look at those non-European experiences as a threat, and sometimes we do, because we worry that Europe cannot compete in a global economy which does not seem to be based on a level playing field, and we all know the issues behind that. Or we can try to look, as we should, at the realities of a rebalancing, changing global economy. We know that sometime this year, the developing and emerging world will produce more of the world's product, overall global product, than the old industrialized world. We better get used to these new realities and place Europe in those new realities in a way which is beneficial to all. So Europe needs to look at the world, I think, a bit differently. The question then is, how is the world looking at Europe? And I have to be honest with you there is a phrase which is frequently used at the ILO, and it's ambiguous. It says, and it's been historically true, that the world looks to Europe for leadership. And in the ILO, that's been true. Europe has been the leader. Today, the world is looking to Europe for leadership because they do not find leadership in Europe. They're expecting that leadership of Europe. And I think there is a strong message to the leaders of Europe that the world, as well as Europeans, have expectations of it. I have to say that President Van Rompuy came to the ILO conference last month and delivered a convincing message about European leadership in the ILO, about the future of the European social model, and about Europe's capacity and political will to provide that leadership. I think we need to think about that, and I'll say something in a moment. Lastly, social dialogue. The European social model is based on partnership and dialogue. The Austrian experience is based on social partnership and dialogue. And I can see, and many people can see, the dividends, the payoff, the value of that partnership and that dialogue, particularly, not exclusively, but particularly at moments of crisis. What we've seen, I believe, in Europe at the national level is a dual process. A number of countries have decided to stick with and use social dialogue for the construction of policies to get out of the crisis. It's been the case here, it's been the case in Germany, it's been the case in the Nordic countries, and despite enormous difficulties, it's been the case in France, in the Netherlands, and in Ireland. Unfortunately, in other parts of Europe, social dialogue has become a victim of the crisis. Greece has seen the breaking down of social dialogue under the stress test of the crisis. Social dialogue does not exist in Greece today. Social dialogue, I believe, is under enormous pressure in other countries of southern Europe. We need to find ways to put the example of social dialogue back in place. My last point relates to what was said by Mr. Kaske in introducing, and Mr. A.Duffek as well, in introducing this debate. I'm reminded of a question put by a leader of the European Commission to a previous General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation. And he said that trade unions needed to do more to support Europe. And the Secretary General's response was, Europe needs to do more to give workers reason to believe in Europe. And that is where I think the political organisations who share the progressive view on Europe need to speak loudly, need to speak clearly to ensure that an alternative vision for what Europe can be is made available and transmitted to our publics. If there is not a positive message from Social Democrats and our friends about the future of Europe, what Europe means, what Europe must be, then an alternative message can prevail. A message which is being heard, and I know it's being heard in Austria as it is in my own country and others, that the right way to protect your people, to alleviate the pressure on working people, is basically to turn your back on Europe. Now, politics, like nature, does not like an empty space, and it seems to me that it is progressive voices that must occupy this space on Europe before populist and reactionary voices win the arguments. It's a battle that has to be fought in all of our countries, and the ILO, I hope, will be a supporter in that battle. Thank you for listening to me. It's been a pleasure.
Herzlichen Dank, Mr. Ryder. Ich glaube, Sie haben uns sehr...
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryder. I think you, in a very impressive manner, showed us how this common house of Europe, which for many years has been an example for social cohesion, social dialogue, distribution, and socially based growth. So this house, it's not that the plaster is crumbling, but the foundations are being undermined. And this is a problem all across Europe, but this is a problem Europe has also vis-à-vis the entire world. And so we need to define a vision and the people in Europe can believe in, and both Mr. Kaske and Mr. A.Duffek will underline that, and it, in my view, has also been repeated. So Maria Jepsen will comment on Mr. Ryder's keynote speech. Maria Jepsen is economist and econometer, and today she is the director of the research department with ETUI, the European Trade Union Institute. Warm welcome to Maria Jepsen.
Invited me today. I think this is it's a very timely conference to have these discussions. Exactly as Ryder said just before, it is very difficult today to go in front of trade unions and have a positive talk about what Europe can do for workers, because it is being perceived as rather pressuring than promoting workers' rights in general. I have several talks where I can say all that Europe has done. This is not what I'm going to do today. I'm going to maybe give a kind of a more visual comment on what we perceive, what we see are the outcomes of the last effects of the crisis, of the reforms, and the economic situation. And I think one of the big issues that we're talking about today, at least at the ETUI, is how Europe is moving forwards. How is Europe moving forwards in terms of the European integration? And I think the observations that we have today is that we are in a rather, I would say, alarming situation with regard to the whole European integration project by itself. European integration project by itself, because European integration project was based on the fact that we would have convergence on socioeconomic issues. This was the main idea behind. That it was done in different ways, fair enough, but it was the main project of the European integration. Instead, today, we find ourselves in a situation where it's rather competitive divergence that is being promoted. And this is what I would like to draw attention to well, I'm not quite sure I can comment. I mean, Mr. Ryder said basically everything I think there is to be said about the situation, but I thought I would kind of maybe give a more geographical perspective to it, to show that this issue is not an isolated issue. This is an issue for all countries in the European Union, and there are actually ways forward, but that these ways forward need to be promoted, because we are getting into a situation where divergence is becoming the main driver in terms of the European landscape. Now, I'll only talk about labor markets. Of course, what I'm going to show is not only due to labor markets, it's due to a lot of other factors. But I've got 15 minutes, and I need to go on. So, what we see today, what does it mean for the European integration project? And the divergence that we are observing, is it a persistent one? Or is it just a cyclical one, a minor hiccup that we will be able to absorb once again? Okay? That would be the main talk. But then I'll go also to the solution point, and I have a very simple, not that simple, concept for shaping the future. How do we need to talk about the future? What are the kind of arguments we need to have a future that is built on upwards converging socioeconomic situation in the European Union? I want to flag up as I said, it's going to be a very visual presentation, and basically it's going to take together a little bit what we've heard today and make it more visual and make us understand to what extent we are actually in a diverging situation. We start with the total employment and total unemployment rates, which, if we look very fast on the graph, and you don't have time and it's too small, but I think it's in your folder, it'll be on the website, you can see that the situation across Europe is really not similar. We know that. But if we go on to another indicator where we can say wages, how has wages developed in the European Union, 2009-2012, once again we see very, very dissimilar developments across the European Union. We have the red areas where basically we have had real wage decreases of below 1%. The dark pink areas, 0 to -1%, also negative real wage growth, and the light pink areas where it's above 0%. What I want you to display to you here is that there's a geographical dimension to this, okay? The countries are not distributed randomly in any way. The periphery countries seem to have a harder impact in terms of wage response to the crisis, but also with regard to all the elements of the crisis. Now, I only use wages here. I could do it with a lot of other indicators, part-time, fixed-term, and so forth, and we'll get the same picture. We'll get that the negative trends are clearly accumulated in the periphery and not in the core of the European Union. Austria being the benchmark, okay? And here the only thing I would like you to kind of remark are how big are the red areas and how big are the green areas. Once again, I'll do this rather fast. What we see, benchmark is Austria. Then from there we can relate. We see that the real wage growth has actually continued, but as was said, the wage share has decreased. Wage share has decreased, it's red. The GDP has continued to grow, it's green, and we can see that the red triangles, areas on the bottom side of the graph, the red ones, is long-term unemployment, and long-term unemployment had basically not increased that much in Austria. So one can say, okay, not a super picture, but not that bad. If we go to Germany, we get the same picture. So basically, the world looks okay, not the best world, but it doesn't look that bad, you know. Germany actually has real wage growth during the crisis. It didn't before. So an improvement in that term. But still some red areas. If we now go to some of the periphery countries, I would like to show you the colors of the southern periphery, Greece, and we can see that everything is gone in red. It's really gone in huge red. Poverty rates are at 31%. Last figures from 2011, 31% of poverty rates. Real wages gone down by nearly 5%. Real GDP growth, and we've got about 57% of unemployment is long-term unemployment. And if we see how total unemployment has risen from 2008 to 2012, we see the increase is huge and it's rapid. So this is a country in real distress. We go on to Portugal. We see somewhat of a similar picture. Maybe the situation before the crisis was a little bit better. There were some green squares, but clearly huge red squares. Poverty rates about 24% of the population. Wage decrease, negative GDP growth, and minimum wages going down. Spain, similar picture, same story. So countries where everything is going and have an accumulated effect of negative trends. So everything is coming together. If we took youth unemployment, as we said, if we take the needs indicators, so young people not in employment, not in training, we'll get exactly the same picture. Huge increases, and there were already rather alarming figures from the start. So countries in a negative downward spirals. If we then go to some of the other periphery countries, the Central and Eastern European countries, we see they went from the green area and they've gone to the red area. Latvia has got 40% of their population at risk of poverty. Okay? Well, they have had small real wage decreases, some change in adjusted wage share, but they actually do have, after having had a huge decrease in their GDP, they actually have moderate to good GDP wage increase. Unemployment has gone up, and long-term unemployment is really high. Here, we don't have any social system to pick up anything. Okay? Romania, yet another periphery country. We see we've gone from green to red with regard, not so much with regard to GDP, slowed down, but real wages and wage share as well. And wages in Romania are not very high to start out with. And again, social networks, fairly bad. So we see different patterns. Periphery countries are suffering, but they're suffering to a different degree. So are we converging or are we diverging? Well, between the core and the periphery, looking at the indicators, and we have some more work at the HUI, clearly there's a divergence with regard to social protection, working conditions, whatever. But we do see a convergence, and this is a convergence between Southern European countries and Central and Eastern European countries on many of the indicators. So maybe not that kind of convergence that we would expect, but it does actually change the entire European landscape in terms of where we need to go and what we're doing. Another divergence we see, and this is within countries, is if we look at what happened to the employment rates on an age structure. We talk a lot about the young. What we don't say is actually we have a positive sign, is that the employment rate for the older workers is going up. Okay, there's been a lot of issues about how the European population needs to work longer in order to pay for the pensions. This seems actually to be happening in a lot of the countries. On the other hand, we have the youth that have been losing employment and with unemployment rates that are absolutely outrageous. This is bound to create enormous tensions. It is creating tensions. It's getting tensions out about intergenerational solidarity, which are caused not by the older workers, but is caused by no jobs available for youth. And so we're getting into huge tensions within countries between populations as well over age groups. Another convergence that we actually have is with regard to employment rates of men and women. Why? Because, well, we all know employment rates rose much more for men. Employment rates went much more down for men than for women. It went slightly down for women. Then it went much more down for men. So there's a convergence, but it's a downwards convergence. It's not an upwards convergence, as was the convergence that was actually one from the beginning. Going to a gender equality index, and I won't get more into this, we can talk about it afterwards maybe. What we see is the green line, the higher the index, the higher the bar, the better the gender equality if one wants. If one looks from the index from 2005 and then again in 2010, we can see the gender equality has risen. The problem is that once one goes into trying to understand why it has risen, the gender equality, it's because men's situation has become worse. So it's not because women's situation has improved, but men's situation has worsened, and hence men and women are becoming more equal. So convergence in terms of equality and chances, but not the kind of convergence that somebody like me at least, would like to see. So how are we framing these reforms? Okay, because I think we need to talk about the European levels. These are some of the outcomes showing that there's a real tension between convergence, divergence going on in the European Union, within countries and between countries. So what are we doing to deal with this? Actually, we're not doing anything. We're not doing much to deal with it. Rather, we have a framing of reforms that is very much based on cost competitiveness. It's based on cost competitiveness. Basically, European Union is today a natural experiment, I would say, for economic textbooks, textbooks. Not the rather developed and refined textbooks, but the very basic, simple textbooks. We need flexibility with regard to quantity, we need flexibility with regard to prices, and if we have this, Markets will redistribute the markets and we'll come into an equilibrium. What we actually see is that we might be getting to an equilibrium, but it's really a suboptimal equilibrium which we will reach. Some of these issues has to do with regulation, of course, and regulation today, at least in a lot of the documents that we read on with regard to the labor market regulation, is that regulation is a burden, and it's especially a burden for small and medium enterprises, so we need to get away with this burden and everything will be much better. The problem is if there's no demand, I don't think that more or less regulation will do much for small and medium enterprises. We also have another discussion about how we need to get a little bit away from austerity. Okay. But if we get away from austerity, we still need to do structural reforms. So we have a trade-off going on right now about austerity versus structural reforms. We need structural reforms. We need a lot of reforms. But I'm not quite sure that I would agree with those structural reforms being proposed are the right way forward for the European Union. The next element that has happened, or is going on, is to the extent that the policy learning processes we had on the social issues and the dialogue process we had on the social issues on the European level enabled countries to learn from each other. There wasn't a direct implementation of policy proposals from the European level on a national level, but there was a policy learning. There was an issue of trying to see how can we transform this into a positive element in our countries. There were social dialogues about how to regulate common labor standards on certain issues. And these elements of learning, of dialogue, have more or less disappeared, and we today have what I would call governing by sanctions. We have a European semester, we have country-specific recommendations, and a lot of the issues that used to be discussed in kind of more informal forums, in more soft forums, are today being discussed or imposed in a quite different way. Now, where the power balance, where these recommendations come from, I'm not saying they come from the European level. Okay? I'm not quite sure that all these recommendations come from a European level. I'm pretty sure they don't come from a European level. They come in from all kinds of sides. They come in from national level, they're pushed up to European level, and they go back again. So it's a whole process, which means that the national level of being interested and influential in European matters has become even more important than it was before. And that's where progressive actors need to have alternatives. And that's where I join Guy Ryder, is that need to have alternatives, need to have policy proposals that are realistic, that are valid, and you need to be pushed into the arena of social policy, of European policy making. Future prospects, and this is where I end, is that we have the high road versus the low road. Okay, we have two roads, and we can choose this road. It's a policy choice. There is nothing that is inherently given in terms of what road one needs to take. Today, when one looks at the maps and one looks at the pink and the red colors, one can say two roads are occurring in Europe. There's more or less a high road for the northern part of Europe, and there seems to be a low road fleshed out for the southern part of Europe. I think in terms of European integration, it is clearly not a viable solution. It fits no country in Europe. The issue, or the idea of having market-driven adjustments on price and on quantity doesn't seem to work, okay? Or it's not filtering through and it doesn't seem to work. We need another adjustment mechanism, and I think this is what needs to be worked on, is what adjustment mechanism, how this adjustment mechanism, and who needs to filter into this adjustment mechanism. The accumulation of the downward trends in the periphery country, I think this is a real worrying trend, and it needs to be dealt with in an extremely serious way. And the way, my simple concept, and I think I use this in basically all my presentations at the moment, is the issue of job quality, okay? Job quality is about social dialogue, it's about regulations, it's about having secure career paths, it's about having predictability into your working life, it's about work-life balance, it's about wages, it's about a lot of very different things. And if we look at these, the link between employment rates and job quality, we've done it for 4 years, I only saw 2010, we see there's a very positive correlation between job quality and employment rates. There is no trade-off. And if we look very close again, we can see that a lot of the countries that had good job quality actually fared much better. So joining again, what Mr. Ryder said just before, there is no evidence that deregulation, that bad quality, that low wages is going to generate more employment. I mean, it was certainly not the case a couple of years ago, so why should this suddenly be the case today? I don't get it. Last point is that this job quality is not equal between gender. Okay, I talked about that we are converging men, women on the gender, but with regard to job quality, the kind of job quality that men and women have is not equally distributed. We've got the males is the blue bar and the females the red bar. Men have higher wages, they have less involuntary non-standard employment, but women have much more work-life balance and working times that fit their world. And this is how job quality is often described for women, is as long as they can combine their life and their work, they have job quality. But as we can see, there are a lot of other dimensions that one needs to filter in. So that was kind of the policy bit I want to say. Thank you.
Danke vielmals für diese
Diskussion. We would like to thank you very much for this very clear presentation. If I got it right, the presentation given by Maria Jepsen will soon be available on the website of both Rennerinstitut and Chamber of Labour. Well, warm welcome to this panel discussion. I have the pleasure of being the moderator. Well, and in my role, I would suggest to subdivide discussion in three parts, and we also saw it in the speeches. In the first round, I would like to discuss the labor market issues related to wage policies, unemployment, labor market policy, to the gender issues we just addressed at the end of Mrs. Jepsen's presentation. And then I would like, in a second part, to discuss the consequences of this labor market developments, the impact on the famous European social model. And in the third part, I would like to address the situation in Austria and, well, find out if we actually live on this island of the blessed. I would like to start with Rudi Hundstorfer. President Kaske, in his introductory speech, again mentioned this notorious lost generation, and I believe that the most difficult, most pressing and urgent problem in Europe is youth unemployment. 6 million unemployed young people across Europe, and the package of 6 billion is made for these. This is 1,000 euros per, wrong figures. Okay, I apologize. Well, what are the measures, and do these suffice? Okay, lovely afternoon. Well, it is clear that these 6 billion cannot be enough and will not be enough. We do not have to further discuss that fact. Europe has learned its lesson. We started, and well, Austria really started this rethinking process. It has taken 2 years, so it was difficult. Now these 6 billion turned into 8 3 weeks ago on the 3rd of July in Berlin, and now we have this 8 billion, not for the entire funding period, but for 24 months. So this does not necessarily mean that we have solved an issue. No, not at all. But we redesigned the funding volume. And then on top of that, from the European Investment Bank, there is another volume of 3 times 6. And this is the volume of the European Investment Bank of 3.6 billion. And this is to create a leverage effect of at least 50 billion. And the topic currently is how can we arrive at this 3.6, which countries are eligible for that. And in the so-called background, a massive discussion is going on, but the first, 6 billion will be available from the end of this summer, August, September. No, what does it mean? No, 8 billion EU, European Investment Bank, 6, so please be so kind and listen. Well, and the EIB, this money can only be called off for youth employment project. And then there's the general topic. The general topic is how can the countries call for this money? Because what we know in Austria, this dual training system, there's just 2 other countries in the EU that have this system. In other words, Austria and Germany. In Greece, they are not aware of such a dual education system. Currently in Greece, we look for some institution, for instance, that provides training measures. For instance, cross and intra-company apprenticeship workshop. This is something we try to establish in Greece, and we try to find somebody to do that. And in Spain, the government, because of the constitution, has no opportunity to do proactive employment policy, because this is fully up to the regions. And due to that, and irrespective of who is labor minister in Spain, irrespective of which party he or she comes from, they have this constitutional situation that they can do nothing. That means what we call stimulating labor market policy, though they have no means to stimulate labor policy. We are in touch with Andalusia. Andalusia is mainly affected by that. And well, let's see how it works, whether we can assist them. Currently in France, and there they are also faced with a special situation. In France, there is something that is comparable to this dual education. But vocational schools in France have to be paid for by the employer, and this is roughly 20,000 euros per year they have to pay per apprenticeship so that they can go to vocational school. This is something we don't know, because in Austria, vocational schools are funded by the state. So there in France, they have a completely different funding model. Sweden, for instance, decided to change its system within 4 or 5 years to a dual education system, following the model Austria and also Germany have. And very in concrete terms, next week we will have Malta visiting us. Well, I know that Malta is not huge, but Malta also wants to change. And they will do that. And the most pleasant country in this connection is Romania. Romania started only last year to change the system. Now they are in the second year of offering dual education. Now they have roughly 36,000 apprenticeship in this some kind of dual education system. Let me mention that the Austrian and German companies that are active in Romania contribute proactively to that. They really assist Romania in developing such a system. So why am I telling you this? Because there is a very diverse picture all across Europe. And within this 6 billion, another group is included. And this group is simply there, and this is a group which is enormously well trained. They hold degrees from universities, sometimes even 2 university degrees from universities of applied sciences. And this is a group we see in Spain, not only in Spain, but in Spain it makes up a major share of people in distress. And we do not have to, focus on fundamental training with these people, because they are excellently trained. But the issue is, how can we open the labor market? Part of this group is very mobile. Part of this group travels to Europe, especially they go to Germany. We have some Spaniards here, just very few, in fact, a few well-educated Spanish people came to Austria. There is a language barrier, which is an issue, and, languages are also always an issue. Well, in a nutshell, we started this rethinking process much too late. We do not have to discuss that, but we have started it. The process has been triggered, and now we have taken the first step. And I assume that what was, successfully accomplished in Berlin last week, this youth guarantee, this training and education guarantee, to implant that in the heads of those responsible. I hope that this process will continue. There will be a follow-up conference in November in Paris. And we hope to see the first result, and we can even check the results and review that, because this 6 + 2, this 8 billion, they have to be applied for with the European Commission. In other words, the countries have to have submitted their applications. And a disturbing issue is the special situation in Spain right now, because we have this bribery scandal. in the Spanish government, because it really covers up everything there. This is the main topic. Well, you can call it as you like, black money, bribery, scandal, and this is not very conducive to the stability of any government. But nevertheless, you have to be optimistic, and I hope that we will be able to have first results by November, and that the first installment of what the European Investment Bank wants to make available, that there has also been retrieved and called for. And well, in Austria, we will not see a single euro of all these programs, and this is good. I deliberately say that this is good because because of our low unemployment rates, we do not form part of this package, and I'm committed to that. And I have always asked for that the money has to go where it is most immediately needed. Austria is one of the few countries which will not benefit from that, which will not see a single cent. And I'm really well committed, and I really support that decision, because what we want to do is we want to assist the countries that want to offer dual education and training systems. We will support them. We can advise, consult them. We provided we suggested to Andalusia that we send Austrian teachers there. Well, we are faced with the language issue, but we hope that we can fare well with English. So even in an apprenticeship workshop, you should be able to speak English as far as this is possible. So in a nutshell, for the first time, and I do not want to shower praise on that, but for the first time this train has started to move. And now for the first time they have taken more money for a shorter period of time than originally discussed. Thank you very much, Minister Hundstorfer.
Karl Aiginger at the Austrian Institute of Economic Research, the European-wide project for Europe is coordinated with sustainable growth of prosperity and employment policy. The question I have to you, Mr. Aiginger, is the following. If we take a look at the speeches we've heard today, we heard a lot about active labor market policy, youth employment, education and training policy. Mr. Ryder also talked a lot about wage policy. Are these the recipes, so to say, in order to be able to cope and find solutions for unemployment in Europe? Or Mrs. Jepsen also raised the question that maybe we need deregulation or opening of the markets in order to promote employment. What is your point of view? I would like to put the focus on what Mr. Ryder said. At the moment, the global economy is booming and Europe is shrinking. World population is growing at the rate of 3% in Africa, in South America, in Asia. There are booms, there is great economic performance, but still Europe doesn't manage to have economic growth. So I guess the key to solving all these problems is to rethink the European model, to come up with a vision. Where is Europe standing? Where does Europe want to be in the future? And how, in times of budgetary restraint, can we realize this European vision? Europe needs more growth, but it has to be a different kind of growth, greener growth, for instance, more inclusive growth that also takes into consideration unemployment, that also integrates young people. And in order to be able to do that, we need a change in strategy on the European level, which we have to go from unintelligent austerity policy to an intelligent labor market policy, including investments into education and training, into research, into environmental technology, in all these fields where Europe might be a leader. The second strategy change that we need is in South Europe, Southern Europe. The programs launched there were important, they were necessary, but they were not enough. The countries in the south had a problem with competitiveness regarding prices. The wages rose much more than productivity, but this has been corrected, and the labor cost situation is at the level of 2002. But the problem was that that correction was done through cutting wages and not by increasing productivity through new companies. So we need more companies in these countries. The industrialized rate has gone down by 1/3. Many industrial companies, businesses left the region. They moved to the Black Sea or even further, and the countries have accepted that loss of jobs as a natural process. They stepped up national spending, and then they were surprised that this was not working in the long time. So the solution is to restore competitiveness regarding cost. This has already been done. Now they need to attract new industrial companies and businesses, because it's not understandable why cheap solar panels can be produced in China but not in Southern Europe. And solar energy, which will be important in the future, could start in Southern Europe because we have enough sun there. So the countries in the south of Europe have high imports of coal. They do not rely on alternative energies. They have higher military imports. Greece, Portugal have the highest military imports, and nobody told them that that might not be the right way to go, to cut the minimum wages and to do not change the military spending. So that we need a new strategy in the south of Europe, and also, for instance, they could come up with industrial zones with different rules to be able to have a very rapid start. And I'm not talking about taxes here. The taxes are not that high, corporate taxes in these countries, but we need very fast administrative channels so that things can happen quickly. Because if you invest in South Europe at the moment, people say, you never know who to contact. It takes 25 years. You can never rely on the information you get. So we really need a rethinking there. And the high-income countries have to find a way of how to stabilize their economic demand. It does not make any sense if Germany has a low-wage policy and builds up a low-wage sector and defends it, and thus brings down economic performance. Germany has been admired in recent years for its growth, but on the whole, the growth was not much higher. Just 8 years before, it was lower. Now, for 3 years, it was a bit higher. So, but it has been going down regarding all social and environmental indicators. No progress in education and training. So there's still a lot we can invest here in order to stabilize demand. For a time, this was done through car exports to China, but Germany has a lot of potential, for instance, environmental investments into education and training, and this would all help to stabilize demand, and that the wage rate went down by 10%, which is not necessary. This becomes important for entrepreneurs when they want to invest. So what I said, we need a change in strategy on a European level. Europe to 2020 targets have to be pursued. We must not forget the 2020 targets. Mrs. Jepsen showed us a nice chart regarding the recommendations, and all these recommendations did not really take into consideration the 2020 targets. It was so the EU does not really stick to the 2020 strategy, even though this is not a bad strategy. But the EU says now we have something better to do, or something more important to do. So we need to change our strategies on all levels, and as a consequence, we have a higher level of economic dynamics. We will have a stronger focus on environmental technologies. We must make sure that the consumption of resources will not go up, and we also have to make sure that the unemployment rate, and especially youth unemployment rate, will go down. This is easier said than done. In our project, we try to find solutions. This is a project with 33 partner organizations. Information is available in the back. We have already come up with the first concepts, how European governance has to work, the role of the Parliament and of the Commission has to be enlarged. And normally, ministerial presidents want to get most of the money for a country. You did not do that because if you because this is a very, very difficult road we all have to walk, but it will pay off because I take the view that Europe, and thank you, Mr. Ryder, for your presentation because you supported it. Europe has the most progressed socio-economic model in the world, also taking into consideration environmental and social targets. This is much better than in the United States, where it's just about getting cheap labor, cheap energy, or the Asian model, which has not been developed that far. So in theory, Europe has the best model. What we have to do is we have to put it into practice. We need more money. We have to spend this money on the targets. And in a budget consolidation phase, we have to save money wherever we can. I was really surprised to see that Europe has higher military expansion than all BRICS countries taken together. So Russia, all these countries, Europe has higher military spending, but nobody knows it because it's 27 countries. But if you take it together, it's a lot of money. And then they say that they don't have money for education and training or for research and for meeting all these Lisbon targets or 2020 targets. So we don't have money for a labor market reform. We don't have money for education and training, but we have enough money for spending it on military and also on the bureaucracy. There's a lot of red tape in these countries where we have money for. So the target has to be to come up with a model saying that Europe is competitive. We do not have a problem with competition. We do not have a negative trade balance. The problem is the distribution. We have to use it for things that are good for growth and for employment, and we have to cut back in some other areas. So whoever wants to help us and support this project, we have a lot of meetings. We're always looking for partners for this project, and everybody has to participate here because it's not an easy target that we have if you want to change Europe. But it is important because Europe has a very good system. We're not in the crisis. Maybe we could say we're in a midlife crisis. So far, a lot of things have worked well in Europe. And the economic crisis, of course, made some of the problems visible, and globalization also highlighted these problems in some parts of Europe where they had very low wages. Now, some other countries have taken over regarding low wages in the Black Sea area, in North Africa. In all these areas, there's a lot of economic growth, and globalization has to be seen as an opportunity. But we have to make our job better, and we must not only think of budget consolidation, because we have to make budget consolidation in a more intelligent way.
Danke vielmals. Wie immer eine ganz
Thank you very much for your very comprehensive statement. Sybille, I would now like to talk about a special topic with you. You're an economist in the Department for Women and Family at the Austrian Chamber of Labor. Mary Jepsen already said in her presentation that the gender gap became smaller during the crisis. The question that I would like to ask you is the following. At the moment, youth unemployment is a top priority, which of course is justified. But isn't there the risk that women's policy will be marginalized so that people say, first we have to find a solution to unemployment and then we can go back to talking about women's issues in the workplace? Or is it in the crisis also very important to take measures specific to women? Well, it's not very surprising that when I talk about gender equality, I do not want that men and women have the same bad conditions, but I want that they have equal good conditions. Of course, there is the risk that the topic will be marginalized. Just take a look at the discussions where women gender topics are just treated as a minor item on the agenda. But there were the drafts for the regulations on the new structural funds, and there we saw clear step back, so to say, as compared to previous documents. And gender mainstreaming was nothing more than a buzzword without any actual effect, unless the national countries take the decision to take action there, but they are no longer forced to do so. This makes me really sad. From my point of view, this is not only unfair, it's not only a matter of fairness, it's also a huge economic problem. The Swedish presidency initiated a study which has been highly debated, and the result of this study was the following: the European GDP could be 15 to 45% higher if gender equality in the workplace was realized. Maybe the methodology was not right, maybe the calculations were not completely correct, but the arguments backing this result were correct. Women have very high educational standards. We have in Austria, more women with an university degree than men, and it does not make any sense not to let the women use their talents and their qualification. So we have to remove these obstacles. And Mr. Aiginger, he talked about the EU 2020 targets. And if you take the targets seriously, and if you want to reach the employment rate for Europe, this will only be possible if you also take the women into the labor market and give them jobs. And the pension systems also very highly debated. This is also a very important challenge in coping with the demographic change, because of course we need many young people in order to be able to pay for the pensions. But this is just crazy. If you take a look at youth unemployment rates of 50%, these young people are not even given a chance to contribute anything to the pension system, even if they wanted to. And again, women play a very important role here. What do we need? We need the right spending. I can only agree that military spending should not be a priority, but you also need some income in order to be able to make these investments. So what we need here is a huge reform in the tax system. We have to fight the tax havens. We need much higher taxation on wealth. We need tax on peak income and on capital income. We need the money in order to be able to come up with reasonable policy. What are the right investments? Well, social services are definitely at the center. Social services are have by far the highest employment multiplier. So whenever I invest €1 in social services, this will generate more employment. Social services contribute considerably to making the life of women and men much better in Europe, because everybody of us needs health care, needs education, needs care, child care, and so on. So this is a very central measure that women who do this unpaid work have to be relieved from that burden and be given a chance to use their high qualifications in the labor market and to contribute to society. And in concluding, Mr. Aiginger talked about unintelligent austerity policy. I think it was very interesting to take a look at the origin of the word. It comes from Latin austeritas, meaning very strict, harsh, but it also means very red color, deep red color. So one could say that this harshness has resulted in very red collars, and that's why it is very, very important to change this approach. Thank you very much. I'm not going to start a philosophical debate on whether the red color used for the Chamber of Labor has something to do with being harsh. Mrs. Desper, a question that's very interesting for me and that I have also asked many of your colleagues is the following. Today, we heard that it is very difficult that all European employees believe in a united Europe because we have very different interests in the individual national countries. So what is your approach, your suggestion? How can we put the things that unite us over the things that divide us? And also please comment on what has been said before in this discussion.
We do to more unite than divide. I think the big problem that we have today is that there is a perceived extremely harsh and negative impulse from the European level, okay? And since European policy, European integration is something that has not been discussed widely within the trade union movement or amongst workers or amongst the population at large, except now, the European integration project is being confused with the policies being proposed by the European level right now. And so there's an amalgam about how Europe is destroying workers' rights, how Europe integration is harmful to workers and so forth, because we are having this discussion about Europe now at a very, very negative moment. And we've never had it before. So one can say, it's a very complicated and very difficult thing to do. But since we've never taken these discussions seriously, and we are having them now because they've become so relevant to everybody's lives, they're very, very difficult to deal with. But I think that there are a lot of very extremely positive issues that have come out of the European integration project. I mean, there's a lot of workers' rights that have been put in place from a European level. I mean, gender equality, anti-discrimination, all these things that are social rights, fundamental rights, they come out of the European level. And I think that is something that we need to emphasize, that a lot of the foundations in our national legislations come out from and have had a positive, has been pushed in a positive way by the European Union. One cannot also say that the European integration has created growth, has created jobs and so forth. And this needs to be emphasized today. Now it's very difficult for me to go out and have this very positive talk currently because you're not being perceived as being credible, right? But I think these are all the things that kind of unite us. You know? So I think these kind of discussions are very difficult to have currently these days. But I think there's a lot of things that unite, and I think that workers are very solidaristic amongst themselves if they're given the opportunity to do it. But if one is not given the opportunity to be solidaristic and one takes away all the mechanisms and institutions that can actually create the solidarity, then it becomes even more difficult to do. But clearly, I think there's a lot of arguments in favor, but I also think that what's going on right now on the European level is not the right way. I mean, it's not the right policies, it's not the right approach that is being put, and I want to be very clear on that one. With regard to where we are heading, I think we have a tension between the short-term urgency, as we're saying, you know, dual vocational, they should have been put in place 20 years ago. They weren't. They're being put in place today in countries because there is an urgency, because the youth is really suffering, because they don't have the qualifications that are needed and so forth. So we're in a moment of urgency where we need short-term measures, but we don't really have the finances to do it. And at the same time, we need to deal with the long-term issues, which is the climate change and the sustainable development agenda that has completely slipped off the face of the earth. We don't talk about that anymore. And that is basically where we need to head, okay? You look into the country-specific recommendations, there's 2 or 3 things in there on it. But if we don't talk about long-term investments today, about the long-term issues today, while we deal with the urgency matters, you know, we're going to continue to muddle through the next 20 years. And I see the real danger of this because it's driven by an austerity. I think it is easing up. There's a lot of talk, but I see very little in actions, and that's what needs to be pushed now, is that these words that are being put on the table by Barroso, by Van Rompuy and so forth, that somebody takes these words and pushes them into real actions so that we can actually have a long-term agenda and not just muddle through in an unintelligent and unintelligent way. On the gender, just one thing, and then I'll pass the mic. is that the danger I see today with regards to the gender issue is that I've made some graphs, I didn't show them, but I've looked at some figures about how the perceptions about women's roles on the labor market and women's roles within the family sphere has evolved over the last years, and there's clearly a re-traditionalization of the perceptions. So men have more right to jobs in times of scarce jobs, and women could reduce their working time to take care of family. These figures are crawling up. So it's kind of a self-reinforcing mechanisms, because if these are the perceptions of the population, then policymakers will react to these perceptions, and then we won't get very far.
Mr. Ryder, do you have any comments?
I could have quite a few, actually, but you haven't got that much time. But just to reflect on what's been said by the panelists this afternoon, listening to Minister Hundstorfer, and again, it's not simply to be polite, I think there is something impressive and something which we should learn from, well, not us, but policymakers need to learn from. There's something impressive about a political position, which is we are going to support extra investment in a youth guarantee scheme, but we don't expect it for us. This is because there is a wider need in Europe for investment in youth employment in those countries which really need it. Now, I want to sort of say, congratulations on that political leadership. It strikes me as leadership which, if others in Europe would take the same type of example, we actually might move forward in the way that Maria's just said. I come from a country which I was told this morning is the most Eurosceptic in the European Union, the United Kingdom. I was surprised that the second most Eurosceptic was Austria, at least historically speaking. And the problem is, there tends to be, I speak from my own country experience, our politicians sort of look at Brussels and they make a calculation. Money to Brussels, money back from Brussels. It's like imports and exports. And if more money is coming in, then it's probably worth being a member of the European Union. It's a simple cost-benefit analysis. Now, there's basic logic in all of this, which is, in the end, the overall figure will be zero because the positives and the negatives will balance out. But until we can restore some type of European commitment to a European project, I think Europe is going to struggle. There, Professor, I can join with what you've said. I think there is, amongst all of the other crises that might be taking place in Europe, economic, social, labour, there's a sort of an identity crisis in the European Union. There seems to be a loss of self-belief. We have our European model. It's got an enormous amount to show in terms of achievement over however many years it is, half a century or so. And yet the feeling today is it doesn't work any longer. We see the other regions growing very quickly, progressing, and we seem to be going backwards. And the conclusion drawn from that, and it's a wrong conclusion, is that somehow we have to let go some of the basic notions of the European social model. Now, I think, and I revert to the political example of leadership that Minister Hundstorfer referred to, I think we have to have some people speaking out in favour of the European model as it was originally perceived. And it's going to have to be some very brave political work. We've got to overcome the negatives, move from the rhetoric of austerity and the practice of austerity, because if you ask the average worker in the street today what Europe means, I'm afraid you'll get a very high percentage who'll say, well, it's to do with austerity, it's to do with wage reductions, it's to do with hard times. The most Europhile country I know in Europe is Spain. And the level of skepticism about Europe in Spain today is enormous. It's unbelievable. And it's precisely due to the experience of the last 3 or 4 years. That's the general point. The more specific points, I think, on gender and women issues, I can only sort of agree with what has been said. We were told when we went to Oslo for our European regional meeting by the Prime Minister of Norway that Norway has gained more in the last 20 years, no, more than that, 30 years, from increased participation of women in the labour force than it has gained from all of the revenues from oil. That just shows you the dividend that you can get from women's participation in the labour force, obviously on a basis of equality. The other thing I wanted to mention, and it was triggered by the reference to fiscal policy, there's a big debate out there right now about fiscal tax avoidance and tax evasion and fiscal paradises. I think it needs to be a debate to be continued to a conclusion. But nobody today has really talked about the role of the financial economy and the financial institutions in the current crisis. Let's start by remembering that it was the financial economy that got us into this crisis. They bear a strong level of responsibility. There was a clearly identified need for reform and regulation of the financial institutions. I'm not convinced 5 years on that we've got as far as we should have done in that regard. And lastly, given that record of responsibility, it is really distressing in the extreme that the financial economy is not even playing its minimum role today, even when it is being government funded and receiving a very strong injection of liquidity cheap from governments. They're still not lending to enterprises. They're still not lending to viable businesses because they can make money much easier through basically putting money into the stock market and avoiding risk. I don't think we're at the end of the story when it comes to the relationship between the financial economy and the real economy, and yet we're not talking about it. So I think I just wanted to just remind us that that's an issue that's out there.
Danke vielmals.
Thank you very much. So you addressed another issue here, but nevertheless we have to focus on brief answers because otherwise the audience will not have the opportunity to participate in the discussion. But the second round focuses on the social state. So a lot has been said about that. But I would like to start with Karl Aiginger, ask him for a brief answer. You said Europe was in a midlife crisis. Now it's about active aging if we continue along these lines. So the question is, well, it is good and nice to have this social system in Europe, but is it still fundable? Is it still competitive in the current situation? So what needs to be done? But please, brevity. Okay, well, it's difficult to keep an important, an answer to a difficult question brief. Well, it's about the social model, but it will look different. It is about the reconstruction of the European social model. Minimum wages will not play an important role as right now. It is important to make sure that those who have just a few qualifications, to upskill them so that they get good wages. It's not about paying for unemployed, but it's necessary to activate them and enable them to participate in the labor market. We do not have the money to fund 50% unemployed and to fund pensions at the same time. This is impossible. We have to activate people in a manner that this does not become reality. This is much cheaper, and a modern social policy is not a social policy in the narrower sense, but a modern social policy is integration of social education and environmental education, because it needs to be integrated. If we look at each area independently, we will not be able to fund that with the current social rate, and sometimes this is where I lose. Well, your applause is the illusions about increasing tax rates. This is something I can just negate. We have the highest tax rate all in Europe. And the question is, who pays? Well, but in total, the rate of fees, duties, and taxes in Europe is higher than in any other area, and we have a nationalized sector of 50%, and the task is to redesign both the tax and the nationalized sector. There is much room for maneuver. If we do not succeed in decisively reducing taxes on the factor of labor, then we will not see a reduction of unemployment. This is not a low-wage strategy, and this must not be a burden on the employees, but it must reduce the wage costs for companies. The strategy is to increase productivity of companies by research and development, but this is a side strategy. It's necessary that the continent with the highest wage costs is cautious and does not add additional taxes on that. And these taxes, and I'm in favor of all philosophies, environmental-based, income-based, property-based taxes, and also you cannot sell this potential twice. You cannot use it to increase the state rate and to reduce, the factor of labor. And I'm in favor of reducing the tax on the factor labor. And this enables us to mobilize work. And something else, I'm very much in favor of Europe that has, alongside the fiscal pact, also a social pact. So there should be a pact in Europe on minimum standards for the European social system, and it's also necessary to strictly check and fund as is the case with the fiscal pact. If you have a fiscal pact and if you have penalties and everything on that, and if you do not have a social pact which is as rigidly controlled and checked, then there will not be a balance. I know that you ask that probably there will be some cut downs on the collective bargaining liberty, but I'm in favor of investigating that, and I would really contribute to this research and assist you, because what could such a social pact include? Well, it should not be a pact that reduces the collective bargaining opportunities, but we need to define factors that check whether, for instance, the budget deficit has declined, but it should be opportunity to gauge whether employment rates have decreased, social aspects have decreased. I know that the trade union are leading in terms of a social pact, but there has not much been going on in this connection. The European House is a sum total of regulations and pacts, and for this reason I believe that the European Social Pact should be designed, which we could design, prepare studies and on a national level, and then find out what we can do at the European level, cooperating with the social partners to make sure that there is not a problem for the collective bargaining situations and collective bargaining contracts, which are very important, which have also enabled Austria and Germany to reach the levels it have. But we need to include youth relevant issues. The interpreters cannot hear these comments in the soundproof booth. And so my suggestion is that if we want to bring Europe forward, we need a social pact and design it appropriately. But in a globalized world, the situation is a different one. It's a question what benefits you can take across borders. These are things that are necessary to look at. Mobility will increase. Lifelong employment in one single place is something which is an issue of the past. We need to improve mobility and improve the connection between mobility and the social system, and then we will be able to be proud of a social model that is a European social model that is competitive in a globalized world. Thank you very much, Karl Aiginger. And Rudi Hundstorfer, there are two concrete social policy questions I would like to address to you. We saw it on the slides presented by Mrs. Jepsen. Poverty in Europe is increasing, and because of the crisis and the associated cut-downs and social spendings, pension systems come under pressure. So what is your view on that? So in the long term, what is necessary to be done in order to prevent poverty? And secondly, save pension systems in a nutshell. Okay, well, the miracle is employment. And then we have training, qualification, skills, qualification, education, skills, and education. These are the three miracle words. And this is what it's all about. So, second thing, in fighting poverty, well, fortunately in Austria we are quite stable. We haven't seen any increases in poverty, no reductions. We are stable. We are on the path we wanted to achieve by 2020. We are well on track, and because of changes in the images of life, there are changes. Single people, the number of single parents has increased much more than 30 years ago. And in this segment, too, we have lots of people at risk of poverty, especially when they work part-time. This is an issue. And when it comes to pensions, well, wherever there was a transfer system, we saw stable development. Where it was capital covered, it was not stable. And Austria is one of the examples for stable development in this redistribution transfer system. Across Europe, one country is quoted, which is an example in terms of capital-covered approaches. This is Norway, but Norway has a lot of oil, and we do not have oil. And therefore, Norway shouldn't be an example for all the other countries. It's great for Norway to have it, no question about that. They increase their pension funds. But when you have such oil revenues, then, well, that's quite clear. Well, in a nutshell, the key issue is employment, and within employment, it's necessary to make sure that these social payments can be made. It's clear that we have a redistribution debate in connection with taxes, because when it comes to the taxation of labor, all across Austria, all across our party lines, we agree. The question is just, where do we take what we redistribute? Where do we take it from? Then there are divergences among the parties. I do not have to repeat that. But let me point to one thing, because we live in the constant process of change. Currently, we have 3.5 million people in Austria which are in employment. And of this 3.5 million, 1 million per year changes the employer. 1 million changes from one employer to the other. We are living in a changed landscape, something that held true for 30 years in the past. I stay with one company until I retire. Well, there is 1 million, and they change. There's a massive turnover in tourism, seasonal workers, and also in the construction industry. There are lots of people who, on a voluntary basis or involuntarily, change. There are some people who change because they want to change the employers, and you also need to adapt that. And in Austria in 2002, there was a debate going on adaptation. And in the meantime, we have a severance payment system that is not related to the employer. And this is very stable, although the interests on the capital covered procedure are not as high as we expected, but that we succeeded in arriving at this severance payment regulation showed that it's important. So 1 million changes per year. There is a constant registration, deregistration, or people like to leave. They quit or find some other job. This is a reality of life because of this 1,150,000 do not need the Austrian labor market services. They do not even go to the labor market services when they change employers. They have made their own arrangements, and 850,000 need the labor market services in order to cover, expenses over certain weeks or to make ends meet over 7 weeks, because 20 years ago figures were completely different. Okay, thank you very much. Sybille, the first topic was women's policy. Now it's family policy, since you are an expert. But family policy is, from a social policy point of view, highly important, also with a view to solving demographic problem. It's not the only instrument, but it's one of the tools we have. We heard about some retraditionalization, so that they remember the old traditions. So where do you see the best practices in a European social model for sustainable family policies? Well, if you ask for best practices in family policy, this is always, well, a low point, because everybody expects that you name the Scandinavian states. And then you have to sit down and say, well, it is the Scandinavian states. Well, this has been proven by empirical evidence. There are countries with the higher birth rates. In Austria, we have 1.6 children per woman. In Denmark, 2.5. Rates we can dream of in Austria. Very low child poverty, high participation of women in the labor market, very low gender pay gap. So these are success stories in all these aspects. And succeed because there are several approaches they take. So first of all, a well-developed social state. Let me point out to the fact that the tax structure we currently have, well, needs to be redesigned, but the Scandinavian states have much higher tax rates than Austria, for instance. And the surface examples for countries which have managed the crisis well with this well-developed welfare state system. So it is about the level of income in total. And if I also have to care for other people, what happens when I lose my income, when I become unemployed? What happens to my family and all my obligations? But then there is one point which is very well known, what is well developed in the Scandinavian countries, and this is the child care system, both in terms of quantity, high rates, and also in terms of quantity, more people, better care ratio than we have in Austria, for instance. It's necessary to invest in both. And the beautiful news about that is that this is genuine investments. This is money you invest in order to get more out than you originally invested. My colleague Adi Buchsbaum and some other colleagues from my office calculated that, and what we see, if we closed the gaps in the field of childcare in Austria, especially for small children, create 35,000 new places, better opening times, better quality, and so on. This would create 14,000 jobs in the field of childcare. In other sector, it creates 2,500 jobs on top of that because of the demand, and then mothers who could work, mothers who were not able to work or could work more than had been the case to date. And depending on the cyclical development, there would be some 40 to 28,000 employees. So up to 45,000 new jobs could be created by just closing the existing gaps in the field of childcare. What would that mean money-wise? Because we always say, well, we cannot afford that, we have to save money. Actually, we can afford that, because from the fifth year on, because of this additional employment, we generate more money than we have to invest in. When in the most pessimistic scenario, then we have just a bit more income than expenditure. And the most optimist and very cautious scenario, it would be 170,000 million more income, more revenues for the government, also for the years to follow. This is an intelligent investment strategy that enables you and families to choose how they wish to design their family life, how much they would like to work, and it makes sense from an economic point of view. And all studies show that it makes sense in the field of equal opportunities for children, because we have stacks of paper that prove that if you want the socioeconomic status not to be the determinant factor for your further career, then you have to start with childcare and invest in the field of childcare. We would have wished that part of the EU structural funds money was used for that, because we believe that it's very important and should take place in all states. Unfortunately, this will not be the case. Nevertheless, we would be able to use this money there. We hope to be successful in Austria because it would be a very intelligent strategy. Thank you very much, Sybille. No, I have to change the script. I'm very impolite towards Mrs. Jepsen and Mr. Ryder, because you need to, you have a plane to catch, other appointments to meet. So I would like to ask the audience for.
Grüß Gott. Ich möchte.
Hello, I would like to talk about an alternative that I have not heard anything about today. That's an alternative against poverty and for a social Europe. At the moment, the European Citizen Initiative on basic income free of criteria, this has been launched by Austrians. So I'm interested in, and this question goes primarily to the federal minister, but every one of you is invited to answer. What do you think of the idea of having a basic income without any requirements? This would result in a fairer distribution. And please do not answer by talking about the minimum benefits, because this is something completely different. My name is Günther Hager-Matun. I'm from the EU Primary Right Initiative. We try to make a social Europe possible, and we are always met with opposition. Mr. Friedel said, if we want a social Europe, then we have to have a change in primary rights. This is a very important step. And everybody is invited to participate. We have come up with a project, and we have been talking to politicians and NGOs and everyone who wants to have a social Europe. There's also a website. It's called Europe United. It's like new and united.eu, and whoever is interested is invited to have themselves registered there. Next, please. I think it's like in a match, football match. You also have to talk about the opponents, and this has not happened here today. I think that financial speculation is a really big opponent problem for us. Mr. Ryder referred to this. A lot of money has gone into this area. Many have enriched themselves or have done so in a legal manner, in a lawful manner. But are really decisive steps taken in order to cut off these financial speculations, so to say, because otherwise the European ship might encounter problems again. I think in 2007 people were not really prepared, so the ship had these problems. And now let me come to gender issue. The people, 99% of the financial business are men. We also talked about the military, where men also make them produce a lot of bad things. And the European ship has been steered by conservatives, and the conservatives do not know how to make economy. They do not know how to make the ship afloat again. And that's something you also have to sell politically, but they just do not know how to do it. Thank you very much for your speeches. I would just like to add two things. Social democracy alone will be too weak. So without the support of the civil law organization, the NGOs, and all other movements, it will be too weak. And all who have already asked questions here and contributed their ideas. So what we need is to join forces here in order to be able to cope with turbo capitalism. And my question to the panel is the following. Ladies and gentlemen, could you imagine that as a counteract to turbo capitalism, there could be something like turbo social democracy? My name is Gerhard Mikolasch. I used to be in the European Works Council. What I'm missing here is creative ideas on how to cut unemployment rates down. Mr. Aiginger said it's not realistic to increase tax rates. So why can't you take the champions in evading tax, these large corporations, to take unemployed people and give them jobs? The second thing I'd like to say is, why can't I come up with ideas on how to prevent unemployment? Why can't I force companies that have billions of profits every year to reserve some money for bad times, so that they can keep people employed even though the economy is sluggish? Why don't I come up with funds, with reserves, in order to have money for keeping people employed or send them into company pension at an early time? There are some examples of companies who've taken measures like this on a voluntary basis, but unfortunately there are only a few of them. The second thing I'd like to say, for more than 20 years, there have been hardly any measures to reduce working times. Productivity has increased by 40%. Only 0.5 to 1% has been passed on in the form of increased wages. Working times have to be reduced drastically to 30 hours, for instance, because then young people will find jobs, because somebody has to do the job, the work. So it's just some practical suggestions from my side. Thank you very much. As we can see here, there's a lot of commitment, a lot of dynamics in the audience, and I'm sure we're going to discuss this also on a more informal basis. But now let me come back to our panelists. I would like to ask all of you, just in 3 or 4 sentences, to let us know the most important thought about this topic, something for the people to go home with. Maria, you're first.
Back to all the issues that were raised by the audience. I mean, I think that whatever forum you are in today, whether it be in big research projects or whether it be in more political discussions like today, the big word that keeps on coming up is that we need investment. Okay, so there is money around, but there is no incentive to invest. And I think this is the main issue that needs to be worked on. And I think that's what needs to be worked on. Now, how to do these investments, this needs to be created on a dialogue basis. You know, it cannot just be, as we had before the crisis, the bubble economy, because nothing has been done to hamper the bubble economy. It'll come up again. And it's being created all the time, small mini bubbles. So this needs to be discussed in another way, how to make the investments, where to make the investments, and to have a more long-term issue, long-term. This won't create jobs tomorrow. And I do think that some kind of working time sharing needs to be done to deal with the sustainable development, but also to deal with the issues that we have currently.
Thank you. Ich möchte ganz kurz 3 Punkte.
I would like to talk about the basic income, regardless of any, without any criteria having to be met. I think the question is, how is work designed and when it is reasonably acceptable? I still think that basic income is not the right answer. Although I am, of course, convinced that it is important to have humane working conditions. But once I have to pay for my education and training, then minimum income, regardless of any criteria, is not the solution. reduction of working hours. Men tend to be interested in working less than they actually do. Women, because most of them have part-time jobs, tend to want to work even more than they are actually working. So maybe you should distribute the working hours in a better manner. And the last item, we heard that women are not represented that well in the financial area. The problem is that the social dialogue is not effective at the moment, and very important stakeholders like female employees are not represented sufficiently. So we need a stronger democratic approach here, because the European Commission and the European Council, they make policy that has dramatic impacts on the people. Thank you very much. Mr. Ryder, what?
I think that it starts and it ends with jobs, with employment, and it's got to be a certain quality of employment. We at the ILO call it decent work. I think there needs to be a very strong political voice, because that, in a sense, is a precondition of the technical solutions, that it cannot be beyond the capacity or the ambitions of Europe to provide job opportunities for all of its citizens. It should not be a concession of Europe to believe that the crisis requires a deconstruction of the welfare state, the social welfare model in Europe. We are in a situation when the world is on target. This will be the latest target for the United Nations, to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. It surely cannot be possible that Europe is going to permit the reappearance of extreme poverty, and it is extreme poverty. We're talking about child malnutrition now in Europe. So I'm quite in favour of joining forces, political forces, trade union forces, civil society forces, around an agenda which might be, turbo social democracy, whatever else wins support. That's fine. But do not believe, and I don't think that we should let it be foisted upon us, that the only way for Europe to succeed economically is through the sacrifice of basic social objectives, which have been the definition of Europe for a generation or more. It can be done. It requires bringing the financial economy firmly into the game in favour of social progress, not as an obstacle to social progress, which I regret to say is where I see it located right now.
Thank you, Mr. Ryder. Karl Aiginger.
I think that the European model is a model of success. It's also a model of peace, and it is also a model that has opened up boundaries and has increased freedoms. A lot of progress has been made also in the field of integration, for instance, Roma people and so on. Now the system is under crisis because the global situation has changed and the system has not adjusted to this change yet. There are some countries who can produce products at lower prices at a high quality, so Europe has to step up, come up with better products and products where the wage is not so important, where education and research and human capital counts more. And we need such a vision for a European course, coming up with the best economic system in the world. We're trying to come up with this vision. We want a social and a democratic Europe. And the financial system should go back to the role that it should have. And we do not want to have the burden on the real economy. the state itself has to reform itself in order to create space for future spending. The state focuses too much on spending and investments of the past. The social system focuses too much on paying work, and if we had a minimum income, this problem would even be multiplied. So what we have to focus on is on activating the unemployed people and integrating them into the labor process, cutting down on labor hours in an intelligent manner. It does make sense. At the moment, a lot of people suffer from burnouts. There are many people who work part-time and want to work more hours. Doing this on a very strong basis will not work, because we do not want to reduce low incomes and have higher incomes the way they are. And some, for instance, you could not cut down on my income, because then I would just simply give 10 more presentations. Reduction by 30% would be a reduction of the working hours without any wage compensation. So that means lower income, lower wages. And as the working hours are regulated for lower jobs, so to say, and not for more qualified jobs, this will result in a shift. Of course, you could react to this with laws and so on. But there's so many other options of reducing working hours, of making people, of giving people the chance of having a better work-life balance. Sometimes employees want to take a break for 2 years, but the employers do not agree. Many people work overtime, and you could reduce the overtime. So there are many options, but the stream of a linear reduction in working hours by 30% should not be a dream dreamt by us, because this would be very detrimental. So the vision is that Europe comes up with its own social system, which is more social and more environmentally oriented than the previous one. Austria would be in a quite good position because it has progressed quite far in some of these aspects. So we might be a role model here, but we still need to change a lot in education and training, and we also have to be more flexible in ecological matters. But Austria could be a model for socio-economic model in Europe. Mr. Hundstorfer, so what is your message? First, regarding the turbo social democracy, I'm totally in favor of that. There's only a minor problem. I have been Minister for Labor and Social Affairs for almost 5 years, and I am the most senior one among my colleagues. 5 years. I've always met new faces, and the new faces, they have no social democratic background. So we have caught up a bit with social democracy. At our meeting, there were 3 of us in 2008. At the moment, we're 6. Let's see how this goes on. So a second topic regarding the taxal aspects, I do not have to come back to that because Mr. Aiginger already covered this. I totally agree with him. We have to find a solution for derivatives, because as long as we cannot do this, all other measures will not work. So the derivative instruments, that's a focus. Regarding the reduction in working hours, I'd like to add an aspect which is quite feasible. We have 300 million paid overtime hours every year. This is overtime that is paid for and that we know of. There's also, of course, a gray area where the experts are not sure on how high it is. But the fact is we have 300 million of overtime. And if out of this amount only 10 to 20% can be changed into real jobs, then we have already achieved quite a lot. Regarding the minimum income, I have been confronted with this question many, many times before. from various people. So I have taken the time to take a closer look at this issue, and my answer is clear. I'm not in favor of this, and I would like to give you the reasons why. I know that you're going to publish what I'm saying now, and that's fine. What I would like to say is I would like that somebody really takes the time to take a look into your funding concept, because your funding concept is really oriented towards a country like Austria. But this will not fit in Denmark, this will not fit in Germany, and so on. You just cannot realize this or implement this in Europe. That's what I have been trying to tell you so many times. After the elections to the national councils, I will take the time to discuss this with you, because now this is just, it sounds fascinating. And this is even hard to implement in Austria, let alone in the other European countries. And as I said, I'm ready to sit down with you and discuss this, but we really have to have a dialogue here. We have to know what means you use to finance this and so on. And then we can take a look whether we can really implement this. But we should do this not here, but...
Meine Antwort ist schlicht.
So my answer is the following. Why are you so aggressive? Please relax. So, as I said, after the elections, I'm going to take the time to sit down with you and discuss this topic, because there are still some questions regarding how to calculate the financial means required for this project. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you very much to the audience. I know that so many questions have not been answered yet, so I hope you will. I know you will be disappointed that not all questions could be answered, but this is a topic with so many different aspects, and we had such a high-ranking panel with intelligent people who had so many things to say, and that's why today I focused on our panelists. I wish you a great afternoon. Thank you very much for your attention.